I mentioned before about the types of people that already are paying too much tax in this country, but most likely will end up paying more. It is the good people who are right in the damn middle. Now, the median income in Australia, I think, is the best part of about $80,000. Some obviously a little more, some obviously a lot less. But the truth is, the way that the pyramid scheme of the federal government is paid for is that it is not paid for by companies with multi-billion-dollar profits. It is not paid for by the GST, which of course is all money raised by the federal government and then given to the states. No, it comes from you and me. In fact, the three largest sources of money to the Australian federal government are, one, income tax, where it comes off your weekly, fortnightly, monthly pay; company tax, where if you've got the right accountant, you'll be doing your best to pay as little as possible, but the reality is that's about $140 billion. But you can see that huge gulf, $200 billion between the workers and the people running the companies. And then the GST is way back where? So the GST, even at 10%, if it was doubled, it would only get to about $200 billion. So unless there's about to be a massive change in that, really the only way the government funds itself, and remember, the way the government funds itself is, firstly, by having more workers paying more tax, but then rather than closing the gap to last year when there wasn't enough workers paying enough tax for all of the promises they made. No. They just increase the promises, and we end up in $1 trillion worth of debt. Because there is an expectation of the next 10 years of budget deficits, that $1 trillion increases. Because according to the intergenerational report, those deficits will go for the next 44 years. You can expect $1 trillion in debt to become 1.5, $2 trillion in debt. But these people, and their little dog too, will have long left the political scene. Well done today in the Channel 9 newspapers, because they have started to have a little look at this, because they say that workers are going to face paying an extra $300 billion in tax. Now, remember, workers already pay $349 billion in tax. So we're close to talking a doubling of the total amount of income tax that the government gets. This is why they are addicted to immigration. This is why they want adults of working age to come here, so they pay their taxes straight away. And while the population right now is sitting at 27, 28 million people, well, eventually you've got to get to 50 million because they pay for the previous 27 that are making their way through the aged care system. Working Australians face more than a $300 billion increase in extra income tax with a decade after the federal spending, if federal spending I should say, is not reined in, and low-income earners will bear the brunt of the growing tax impost, says a former Productivity Commissioner head. Michael Brennan, now the Chief Executive Officer of an independent think tank called E61, said the entire tax system would become more dependent on income taxes and less progressive, with people on the minimum wage facing the steepest hits to their take-home pay. Now, of course, that logic being that, as you know, tax-free threshold is about $40,000. Well, if the minimum wage slowly but surely increases, but that $40,000 tax-free threshold never changes, then they start to fall into tax brackets where they start to pay taxes. The total amount being added to the trough for the federal politicians, not to balance the books or to pay off $1 trillion worth of debt. No, it's just more spending on top of more spending on top of more spending on top of more spending. The Australian electorate has shown at how many elections in a row now that they can be bought. The triangle of dependence that means 50% of people have got their hand out or are recipients of government welfare. Believe that's unbelievably the case. People's employment is directly linked to the government because they work for state or federal public servants. There's more than, about 1.5, 2 million people like that. And if you're in private business, well, the single biggest customer is the government. Hence the $90-something million that was spent on the website redevelopment for the Bureau of Meteorology. So it is in the government's interest to keep spending because that creates greater dependence and eventually a permanent political majority. But the one thing it absolutely leads to is a series of deficits, increases debt, and at some point debt becomes the single biggest thing that you are trying to pay off each and every year. In fact, debt in Victoria alone is going to be $28 million, not a year, not a week, but a day, most likely before the next Victorian election. This stuff matters, no matter how often the politicians want to pretend. No, it doesn't.